BBC World Service, they didn't even have computers. They had word processors, which we weren't allowed to touch. We had to dictate to a typist our stories. We would get wire copy from the AP, from Reuters, from AFP, PTI, all around the world, all the different wire services in English, distill what was common amongst their messages, always more than one source. Everything had to be at least double sourced, preferably more, which is a principle I think that applies across the board in many aspects of daily journalism and other aspects of journalism. And then dictate our story to someone who was much smarter than we are and had been there for 20 years and could probably write the story on their own, but because they were considered a typist, and more than half of them were men, so it wasn't a sexist thing, had to do that job. And if we touched a keyboard, then there would be a strike. They would close the newsroom, and so even if it was a big panic and someone important had just died and had just been confirmed and your typist was on a tea break and no one was near, you couldn't touch that keyboard. That's a story that ended in 1988 when we all had to learn how to type all over again. I did that for a few years, and then they did a rather bold experiment because I don't have a British English, any sort of a British accent. I sound North American. I'm a Canadian. And I don't think anybody in the world can tell us apart from our American cousins on the North American continent except other Canadians. So it's not very different. And they decided to let me be a reporter. They wanted a foreigner reporting on what was going on in Britain. The idea being that it was a news service for people in foreign countries. It was not a news service for British people abroad, although it sometimes sounded that way. It was a news service for people that needed to understand what was happening all over the world. So I actually ended up going to Northern Ireland and doing all sorts of reports in Britain in my funny accent, which offended a lot of British people abroad, but got me a lot of friends in Africa, Asia, South America, and elsewhere. Mostly they couldn't figure out who I was and where I was from and why this Yank was reporting for the BBC, but they liked it. I then went on to Pakistan, where I got a job as the BBC's Islamabad correspondent. I'd been going back and forth to India and Pakistan at that time, and so it worked nicely. I moved there with my family, and in those days Islamabad was one of the nicer places to work. It was green and pleasant and safe. We had various small problems, and bombs were just starting to go off, but it's not nearly the place it was today. I went to Afghanistan a lot. You could travel everywhere in Afghanistan and be more or less perfectly safe except for theft. It was a different era, you know. There was no war on terror. There was no Al-Qaeda. There was no. It was a different time. All of those seeds had been planted, and those plants were growing, and we were reporting on them, but it was safe for journalists, which is, I think, a big difference with the world today, where journalists are now a target. We didn't feel like targets in the 90s, in the early 90s. Of course, I came to Delhi a lot. If you were living in Pakistan, Delhi was where you came to have a beer, basically. Pakistan was a Muslim country. It was dry. It was, well, very friendly and extremely helpful in terms of people, the government, and so on. It was still a place where you had to keep local sensibilities very much in mind. And Delhi was the nearest big city for us, the nearest cosmopolitan city. So we came down here a lot. And it was natural that I applied for a job here in Delhi with the BBC. By that time, the BBC had television for the world as well as radio. The internet was, they were just starting to creep onto the internet in a very clunky way, putting our scripts online without editing them and that sort of thing. Very strange. And that turned into a 12-year stay in this part of the world. I moved to Nepal from India, worked in Nepal for 4 years, covering the Royal Massacre and the Maoist Civil War and all the other issues that grip the poor in countries across this region as they assert themselves, as they travel abroad for work, as they change through exposure to the world. And it was very suitable then that my next posting be Miami in the United States. Because Miami, although it's an American city, is probably the capital of Latin America. If you want to fly from Brazil to Honduras, you probably go to Miami first and connect. And people from every Latin American and Caribbean country lived in Miami. And it was a delightful place to work for the BBC because they didn't actually want me to cover Florida politics or Florida issues, although some of them were very good. They wanted me to cover what was going on in Haiti, or what was going on in Cuba, or what was going on in Dominican Republic, and so on. But I still kept coming back to India. I kept coming back here. The tsunami in 2004 meant that everyone who worked for every news organization everywhere in the world had to cover what was then the biggest story that was happening around us. So I came to India and spent 6 weeks in southern India, in Tamil Nadu, meeting victims of the tsunami and covering the cleanup operation. That led to a really interesting thing the following year, or Hurricane Katrina, which wasn't quite the following year, but very shortly thereafter. I was 3 weeks in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit, working for the BBC, and we were running out of things to say. It had been a long haul, and the media covered it rather extensively, and the issues were well known and well discussed on the air. And someone at BBC World Television hit upon the idea of asking me to compare the relief operations I saw in New Orleans with the relief operations I'd seen in India, where I'd covered the Gujarat earthquakes of 2001 and the tsunami recovery. And I had to be honest and say that I actually thought the Indians did a better job. Yes, it was chaotic, but there was a wonderful response from the ground up. And certainly in where I was in Tamil Nadu, the authorities, civilian authorities and the military had done a rather good job of responding to people's immediate needs, medical and so on. And then as the days went by, more and more NGOs and informal groups and religious groups and everything, everyone converged and was providing a lot of health and social services to people down there. Whereas in New Orleans, there were real gaps in the provision of service. One reason was that the National Guard, the militia in the United States, was mostly deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, so not available to respond. Another reason was no leadership from the federal government, the United States, the central government in Washington. I said this on air, not in any kind of judgmental terms. I said, well, here's the evidence for doing a good job in India, and here's what's missing here. But on the other hand, the pace is picking up. And that's when I discovered right-wing bloggers in the United States. All of a sudden, and they also knew I was a Canadian, of course. They discovered that there was a foreigner comparing them badly to foreigners. So you saw the world, the globalization of the world in action right there, just with a single couple of sentences in a live interview on British television. It gets a little bit tiresome after a while, going from disaster to disaster, and there are a lot of disasters, unfortunately. And my children were getting older, and we wanted to settle down and be in a single place for a while. So moved to Toronto, and all of a sudden I was in a country that was very calm. And some would say boring, but I would say calm. Canada is very well organized, and like Scandinavia, takes care of its citizens from the moment they're born till the moment they die. And I had to keep coming back to India, to Southeast Asia, to the Middle East to continue my work. But journalism, you know, is hard work. It requires constantly being on top of issues, remembering your basic skills, which even though you've learned them, you still have to keep on top of. And working for the BBC got increasingly busy with 14 radio networks and 5 television networks and 3 or 4 different online networks to provide content for. So I branched out into freelance work, wrote 2 books, both about India, made several films about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Pakistani community in Canada, how it was suffering under post 9/11 from discrimination. And that, you know, is the sort of opportunity that opened up for me because of years of journalism with a very strong and powerful base in an organization like the BBC, a network of contacts around the world. The one thing that you take with you throughout your life are the contacts you make from school onwards, and from job to job, sector to sector, or different aspects of journalism, content provision for all sorts of media. aside from your skill at writing and using your ability to sort facts from fiction and to balance a story so that everybody has a say, your contacts are probably the most valuable thing you own, and that's what I've realized probably in the past 5-6 years, that everything I've got in terms of consultancies, film commissions, easy jobs, difficult jobs, has been because I was able to, probably within a couple of minutes of initiating a discussion with someone about a project, think of a way to phone up 7 or 8 people and shape an idea for the person sitting across the desk. And all of that is because, as a reporter, as the most basic reporter for a small Canadian newspaper, radio station, or television station, that's what I did every day, was try to expand my contacts and keep on good terms with people who had been sources, and meet people at social functions or friends of friends, drink a lot of coffee or tea, and just keep those contacts alive. So when I moved back to Toronto, I was able to pick up assignments with international organizations. I worked for Canadian law firms that were working in India. I helped out on the BlackBerry file. You know that BlackBerry and India are having negotiations about encrypting data. I was able to make some contacts for the law firm that works with BlackBerry. It's remarkable what you can achieve just, and I don't regard it as direct journalism, but I regard it as using my journalism skills. I can think through a story. Everything's a story. So BlackBerry has an issue with the Indian government. The Indian government wants BlackBerry to do something it's never done before. I can think, well, you know, I know this person in the Commerce Ministry, and we can make common cause with the Indian business community who really rely on this encryption. So here's a couple of people to talk to in Bangalore and Hyderabad. And the next thing you know, we can put together a dossier. And that's almost like preparing a news story, but only for a select small audience of people. I'm also doing some work right now for the Bloomberg initiative to reduce tobacco use around the world. Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, is becoming the Bill Gates of tobacco, anti-tobacco, if you like. And they're targeting all of the large tobacco-consuming countries in the world: Brazil, China, India, Russia, Ukraine. So I've been advising them on the Indian media and how the political system here works. I pretend I know that particular part of it. I know more than them, which isn't. Again, it's journalism.